going to happen if Toronto can't get these rent prices under control? It's a question I first thought about 5 years ago. My rent skyrocketed $950 a month. I thought, there's no way. Back then, I remember thinking rent in Toronto was extremely expensive.
This is the cheapest place I found in Toronto.
I'm just having a hard time saving up for any kind of future in the city.
Now it's way worse. The average monthly cost for a one-bedroom apartment in September 2023 was more than $2,600.
It's a perfect storm of factors leading rents to rise at an unprecedented speed.
Not so far off in the distant future, he says, we could see rents of $3,000, $3,500, eventually $4,000 a month.
When I say soaring rents, things are changing very fast right now. This isn't, a slow burn.
The question is, who can afford that? The average household just can't. It got me thinking, what's going to happen to the city? What will it turn into? What will it look like? And perhaps most importantly, who will be left? We know rising rents are making it increasingly difficult for lots of people to keep a roof over their heads. But could skyrocketing rent be one of the reasons why we're seeing a shortage of workers in a number of industries? You bet. And it'll likely only get harder to recruit people to work in Toronto if they can't afford to live in Toronto.
Key workers and essential workers, paramedics, police, fire, teachers, and nurses, if they can't afford to live in Toronto, the hospitals won't be able to staff in terms of both medical staff and support staff, the cleaners and the custodial staff and the orderlies that keep hospitals going. So there are effects right across the labor market and across the economy that really do affect the capacity of a city to function.
This was the problem in places like London, England, and New York City, where employers needed to create key apartments where people could come and live in the apartment while they were working there and then go home on the weekends because they couldn't afford the time to commute.
People won't move to the city if they can't live close to work. So how many hours a day are people willing to lose just to get to work and come back home?
The most expensive houses and apartments are, of course, along the subway routes, but low-income people don't live anywhere near the subway routes. So that's the real cost, is the long commutes and extra expenses imposed on other people who can least afford it.
Moving further and further away, at what point do you just give up and move altogether? Turns out many people are already doing just that. We saw people leave the city during the pandemic when working from home became a thing. Well, life is maybe not fully back to normal, but close. We're still seeing an exodus from Toronto. A record number of people left Ontario in 2022. The top reasons: the soaring cost of living, stagnant wages, and low housing affordability.
Certainly people struggling with housing understand it on a kind of visceral level, right? Like, wait a second, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. I went to school. I even got a couple of graduate degrees. I have a pretty decent job and I still can't afford housing. Like, wait, the social contract is broken.
That sort of pattern of migration out of Toronto, I think will expand and accelerate. People will say we just simply can't afford to live in this city, and they won't come. So there are a whole bunch of broad economic impacts that I think that will put Toronto on the edge of a cliff.
As much as the city is about its neighborhood businesses and shops, to me, the heartbeat of Toronto is the culture, the arts and music scene. So what happens to that if rents keep rising?
This is
Oh.
It's Nicole!
My name is Aurora Brown, and most people these days know me from Baroness Von Sketch Show, which is a comedy sketch show that I helped create and star in on CBC. I've been living in Toronto and performing here for a really long time.
She's been making Canadians laugh for years, and she knows how hard it is for artists to find affordable housing even at the best of times. She says she was lucky to find an apartment in this neighborhood at a pretty good rate.
A lot of the people who worked in the building were artists of various kinds, musicians, photographers, makeup artists, sketch comedians. That kind of stability of homing and rental units makes it possible for people to keep living in and enriching the city that they're part of.
But in 2016, just as her show and professional life were taking off, out of nowhere, the landlord sold the building. The new owners handed out eviction notices to all the tenants. They eventually gutted the building before putting the units back on the market as luxury rentals. But Brown and another tenant did something not many people necessarily have the resources, time, or energy to do. They fought back.
We couldn't hurt them in their business practices in any way. We couldn't stop them. I don't think they ever felt shame or anything like that. So any kind of comfort we did was cold comfort.
Eventually, the tenants won a settlement. Brown and her family found a new apartment at a much higher rent in the same neighborhood.
I know the rest of the country loves to hate on it, but I think if they lived where I live, they would have a really good time. It is a lovely place to live when you have a good neighborhood. And I've also been really fortunate to have, head Baroness means I can pay rent. But it's a grim situation out there for a lot of actors in particular.
Like, what happens to a place like Toronto if we keep going down this path?
Well, I mean, look at Yorkville, in the 60s, Joni Mitchell, that was the place for artists and hippies, and now it's the most expensive store. So I would imagine that's probably going to happen. I think you're going to either see people living in squalor stacked on top of each other, or you just have people leave the city. And all the people who are coming in and buying houses in the cool places, I guess it just won't be cool for very long unless they all start putting on sketch shows and doing all that stuff. I don't know.
Let's be honest, while many people are struggling right now, Toronto is also home to a lot of rich people. As affordability and the housing crisis gets worse, expect to see more polarization.
15 years from now, we'll have a whole part of the city that is full of people without very good life opportunities, earning very little money.
That's David Holchansky. He did a study on this very topic more than a decade ago, predicting exactly what we're seeing today: a city for the very rich and the very poor, and a disappearing middle class. No one has a crystal ball, but much of what we've heard from the experts about Toronto's future just isn't good. And I'll be honest, at times it felt hopeless, but when I asked some of the smartest people who've been studying this issue, some of them for decades, is there hope? I was surprised by what I heard.
And so long as people are angry or feel hopeless and want their governments to do something, something will happen, because you need to keep the pressure up.
Organize. If you're not organized, you're not going to achieve something. So tenants are poorly organized. They do their best. They're becoming more and more organized with these rent strikes.
I am, again, hopeful that there's a younger generation out there who views housing as home, and even maybe some young folks who want to get into the business of housing but aren't in it or don't want to be in it to make oodles of money, who kind of recognize that maybe there's a way to do it in a more sustainable way, in a more human rights friendly way.
So what will Toronto look like if we can't get these rent prices under control? Who will be left? Probably lots of people. We're a long way from seeing the city hollow out. Toronto is a magnet and people won't stop coming here. So maybe it's more about how those people make it work. What kind of a life can you build here? Because if something doesn't change soon, we may continue to see a deepening divide where only some Torontonians are thriving and many others are just barely surviving.